In episode 6 of Studio Effects, I'm going to talk about equalization, or EQ. Now, this is really, for me, it is kind of a corrective tool, but you can use this in a creative way as well. Now, what we've got at the moment here is a window on Logic, but this is, again, not DAW specific. You can apply any of these rules to Cubase or Ableton or FL Studio or Pro Tools or GarageBand for iOS, for example. Now, what I've got is some bands, some frequency bands. You think, well, what are those then? Well, the human ear can hear between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, pretty much roughly. Other people have different capabilities. As you get older, your top end tends to slide off a little bit. So you can't hear 20 kilohertz so easily when you get older. Now, of course, if you have hearing loss or any sort of hearing deficiencies, your frequency response becomes unbalanced anyway. Now, what we've got to think about with EQ is, does the recording need it or not? Don't just add it for the sake of it, because you might play something, you think, it doesn't need any EQ at all. And very often when you have stuff that is very, very well recorded, the chances are the equalization, you won't need to do a huge amount. Now, this is Logic's equalizer. We have 4 parametric bands in the middle, 2 shelving filters, and then a high pass and a low pass filter. Rather the other way around, that's a high pass and low pass is at the right hand side there. We also have a scale here. We've got -30 to +30. Now what happens is, if you move a spot like this, you are boosting a particular frequency, and at this you're cutting a particular frequency. Notice that it's not a square, or there's always a bit of a curve to it, and I'm going to go through that in a second. What I'm going to do first, though, is I'm going to play the drums only of this tune. I'm going to get a real drummer on this, but this is a good example because it contains something that is at the bottom, on the left-hand side, contains something in the middle, and on the right-hand side. So the bottom is your bass drum, and you've got snare drum in the middle, hi-hats at the top. So you can see that various things are happening to that drum kit. I accentuated the snare drum a little bit, and then I brought the hi-hats up and then back down again. Now you can see that this one, for example, has a steeper curve than the others. And that's this setting down here. We've got the frequency at which you boost or cut, which is clear enough. We've got bass, mid and treble. And then we've got the amount that you have boosted it. This is plus 10 dB. That's rather a lot. And then we've got a third figure, which is called Q factor, or quality factor. And what this does is to select a particular frequency band in terms of the width of it. Sometimes it's known in octaves as well. So, and that actually does sort of happen on some mixing desks. It'll give it in terms of octaves rather than an actual figure. Now, as I turn this up, you can see that that band gets narrower. So we really can home in on various frequencies. If I turn it right up to 100, that's really high. No analog mixing desk can achieve this. But, you know, you've got to ask yourself, well, why would you do it on the computer? But when I play this in a minute, you'll kind of hear that it's a bit weird. A computer also can go plus or minus 30 dB either way. Mixing desks, generally speaking, are about plus or minus 15. So it's a much finer control. So it brings that question of whether it's well recorded or not back into the fore. So if I just play the drums again. So it sounded like a water droplet. You know, you can use that as an effect. And this is the sort of thing that you can automate on the computer as well. So you can record your performance on the EQ pane there. Now, it's more sort of apparent when you boost frequencies, but you can also cut them. If you've got a niggly frequency, my voice has got an annoying frequency of about 2 kilohertz, and there's this sort of nasal quality that I try and get rid of. Now, of course, you can't get rid of something completely, but you can have a good go at getting rid. If you've got something that's got a lot of mains hum on, well, the ideal thing is to record it again. But I could say, well, I'm going to take this frequency slider to 50 hertz. Now, if you're in the US, this will be 60 hertz because that's the frequency of your mains. Now, if I take my parametric equalizer there, set a quality factor of 100, and then cut it, you can see that I'm able to cut that frequency, 50 hertz, leaving 60 hertz relatively unscathed. Now, you will notice holes in your response, and if it's something like a bass guitar part, for example, 50 hertz is a G, it's third fret on the bass. In the States, at 60 hertz, that's your B flat at 6th fret or 1st fret on the A string, and you might notice a distinct hole in your bass line. So really, you've got to try and sort that mains hum out before you start. And indeed, mains has harmonics. If you take this other parametric, for example, and move it to 100 hertz at maximum quality factor and reduce that as well, you are reducing the harmonics of your mains, which may manifest itself as buzzing instead of actual low hum. So there are things that you can do with an equalizer in order to correct for that. Now, very often in my mixes, I find that it can be a bit deficient in mid-range. Everyone sort of concentrates on that sort of breathiness. Oh, listen to how detailed this is, or listen to how much bass is coming out of this. But they tend to neglect the middle. So you end up with this sort of smiley face graphic equalizer. You've got bass and treble, and then this sort of middle, which is sort of a bit cluttered and a bit vague. So if I open up my master equalizer, you can see that I have actually lifted the mid-range a bit. Perhaps I should reduce the treble a little bit, just to make that mid-range stand out a bit. So, I mean, that's quite a lot. That's 5 dB in the middle, and it's quite a wide band as well. You don't really want to have very narrow bands with the overall mix because it will create this sort of slightly out of phase sounding noise where you get something like this. And you get ringing because you're actually boosting really certain notes of your scale. If I moved it to 440 hertz, for example, which is a concert A, you'll hear la. So all of those frequencies at 440 hertz will be boosted to within an inch of their lives. Some EQs allow you to have an analyzer, which you can see at the moment, so you can see frequencies as well. But don't look at the pretty pictures too much. It's your eyes that are the ultimate judge. So there is a little bit about equalization. Now, what you should do, really, with anything that you've recorded in an audio sense, that is through a microphone, unless it's bass guitar. If you've recorded anything through a mic, as I've done with my vocals here, for example, if I look at my backing vocals here, you can see on the first backing vocal there, I've cut frequencies below roughly 100 hertz. Now, this is to do with the fact that if you've got a vocal, it may not have any bass on it, but the mic will be picking up sort of rumble and all sorts of bass end from elsewhere. And if you have lots of channels that are doing that, if I'm doing string parts, for example, and violin hasn't got anything really below a couple of 100 hertz. And if you've got all of these channels, which have all got the rumble on, suddenly your mix will sound really confused. And you're thinking, why is the level really, really loud? I can't really hear anything. And that actually, it's adding together all of those rumbly frequencies and outputting those through your speakers when it needn't. And actually, you can end up with all this really high level coming out of your computer and comparatively low output level on your recording. So cut everything below 100 hertz, apart from kick drum, bass guitar, maybe your low tom, other things that require a little bit of depth. And that 100 hertz that's negotiable. It could be 80, it could be 120. But if you've got, something that's really high frequency, like high strings, you can cut everything below 500, for example. It really is a case of looking after those bass frequencies. So there we are. There is a little bit about EQ. You can have all sorts of things. If I go to EQ, vintage EQ collection, vintage tube EQ, you get a nice pretty picture of an old sort of tube equalizer where you've got low boost, high boost. This is essentially bass, treble, high bandwidth. That is the quality factor. And you have all sorts of nice little old vintage switches that you can play with. But, as always, the ears are the ultimate judge.